So, for tonight's message, tonight's message essentially piggybacks off of the message from the last session. If you think of it kind of like a part two, that's kind of the reality of what it is. Last time we met, we talked about, the certain penchant that we can have to become the bad guy in our own stories, and we kind of explored the reality of that and why that happens and how. The way that a lot of Christians can easily become Pharisees when they stop paying attention to why the law, why the gospel, why the Bible, why all these different facets of sort of rule exist, and start focusing purely on those. When it becomes the kind of thing that, your walk with Jesus stops being a walk with Jesus and starts being an adamant following of rules. And eventually you lose the spirit and the purpose behind those things. We talked about that. We also talked about the way that, how some of us, we can get into places where we'll justify, villainous behavior. We fall into that mindset of the ends justify the means, which is so completely averse to God's character. Everything that you read in the Bible, specifically within the way that God lays things out, is it's never the ends justify the means, it's the means that matter. Even if you do everything right and fail, that matters more than doing everything wrong and succeeding. And our world doesn't really appreciate that because we're very much so mindful of success. What we value, what we pursue is whatever's going to achieve our goal. And as such, we glorify these concepts in these situations where we're going to, hurt and bend and do whatever it takes to get the job done, as it were. And that's not really okay. And there are a lot of people in the church that definitely take that mindset. I mean, there are people in this group who have undoubtedly been told that, they were a problem for another believer, in the sense that that other believer determined that, yeah, you're not worth my time. You're actually a draw on my love and compassion. You're hurting my walk with Jesus, so I'm going to cut you out of my life, and you can go away. There are people in this group that have been affected by that particular mindset unfairly. It's not like these people were, trying to drag these Christians away from their life of following Jesus. No, it was simply they had disagreements or fights or things like that. Or this person decided to be extremely judgmental, and as a result was just like, yeah, no, I'm done with you because you're a waste of my time. There's a huge problem with that when we talk about the character of Jesus Christ and what he taught, and especially if he's supposed to be our example. Like, I can't remember where the verses are off the top of my head, but there are two that come to mind, and the first one was the one where the disciples are telling children not to come to Jesus because they're going to bother him. And and Jesus rebukes the apostles, the disciples, and then has the children come to him. There's a vast difference. There was the way that Jesus had all of the invalid, all the wounded, all the suffering coming to him for healing. He didn't get upset by them. He didn't get upset by the woman crawling across the floor and pouring oil, cleaning his feet with her tears. Other people were just like, what is this? How dare you? That compassion that Christ had is such an important part of being a follower of Jesus. And that's something that we really have to look at. And losing that compassion is when we start to become monsters. Like, I'll just put this straightforward. If you cease to have compassion as a follower of Jesus, you stop being a follower of Jesus. It's a very, very simple concept. If you can find a place to validate a harsh, judgmental tone of cutting innocent people out of your life, you're gone, and you need to be reset. And that's a lot of what we have to talk about tonight. And Dusty has some stuff that God gave her as well, so we'll bring that up as well. But the biggest thing that he gave me was, when you become this thing, what do you do? We spent last time talking a lot about how it can happen. We talked a lot about pride, and about how pride is one of those sins that's so incredibly great for leading us down these paths. How you stop seeing your own faults and flaws. You focus instead on what you're good, where you're good, and where you're your best. And what's more is you start focusing on the people around you and how they're not like you because you're so good, you're so great. And that's the thing with pride. And the biggest thing here is talking about this issue tonight, and even what this is meant for, is that of confronting that thing. See, we used a lot of villain and superhero analogies last time. And the thing about it is that when you look at those stories, those villains will go unchecked unless somebody checks them. That's why there are heroes in the story. The heroes oftentimes rise up to defend against these villains. If nobody did, well, the villains would win. Bane would have succeeded in tearing Gotham apart and having the city eat itself. Thanos would have wiped out half the universe and continued to live on his farm at the end.
That sounds so magical.
Loki would have done whatever Loki wants to do. Whatever that, he would have been a god somewhere. The point is that, and the thing of it is that they would have completely overrode the freedom of the people around them in order to achieve these goals, which is where we end up drawing the line as far as what is evil and what is not. When you start overriding the choices of the people around you, when you start saying, okay, I know better than you, and I'm going to make this decision for you. That's not to say there isn't a time and a place for that, but for the most part, when it's in order just to achieve your own ends, and there's some self-involved kind of method here, you're going to only become the worst example of this, and you're going to be wrong. Even like we talked about Magneto. And, the thing about Magneto for his story was that he was this, he suffered through the Holocaust and all these different things that happened to him. And as a result, he had this very hardline stance, and he was trying to defend his people, the other mutants. And the irony of it is that he believed that, if he didn't do what he was doing, if he didn't fight and kill and hurt and maim and commit acts of terror, then regular humans would never accept mutants. So he was going to force them to. And the whole time you got the X-Men fighting him at every turn, trying to create a balance there, trying to show the world around them that, yeah, they were good mutants. The irony is that he probably ended up just fulfilling his own prophecy by creating a situation where people are going to people are scared of mutants anyways. Even in that particular situation where when you look forward he ends up being right, it doesn't matter because part of it's its own fault. in his effort to stop the bad things from happening by doing bad things, he actually ensured that the bad things were going to happen. So in all of these examples, somebody stood up to these people and fought them. And the truth of the matter is that this message is not meant to say, you know, if Dusty starts becoming like this terrible monster, obviously Jeremy should like show up and fight her in order to stop her from, you know, burning people with cigarettes and stuff.
How's Slytherin? I'd join her.
It's yeah. It's actually more along the lines that we're talking about ourselves, looking at ourselves in this particular situation. Because nobody's going to be better able to quell the monsters within us than us. We have to recognize our shadows. Recognize that we're not actually there, or we're not actually where we think we are. And that's the way that we overcome pride. There's that side of it of being humble in the face of scrutiny. If you hear somebody tell you, you have a place to grow here, you're not actually as strong of a Christian as you like to think you are. You're actually kind of a hypocrite. That's a hard thing to receive because it's very, very, very adversarial. But more than that, it's almost insulting. And nobody wants to take that. But you know what's funny about humble people is that they do take that. They listen to that. I always remember this time when my brother-in-law and I got into a fight. And basically he was being kind of a jerk to the rest of his family, and I called him on it. And then he proceeded to just lay into me about all these things that I was doing wrong. Normally, I would just fight him back. But in this instance, for whatever reason, I stopped. And I just looked at what he wrote, and I was just like, okay, you know what? Why don't you go ahead and explain that? Where you're getting that from. And he was just like, no, it doesn't matter. I'm like, no, it does matter. I want you to tell me why you believe what you believe. You don't get to just say all these things about me and then presume to let it go. I want to know why you believe what you believe. He proceeded to share some things that I had not seen about myself. I had been way too caught up in how I thought I was being and how I thought I was acting. And I didn't see the reality of how I was actually acting and how that was being received. It was kind of a humbling moment to kind of look at that and realize that, yeah, I wasn't as good as I thought I was being. Even though it came in the midst of this like blow up fight and so on, it didn't matter. What mattered is what I was able to take from that and actually really see. See, usually when we get into states of pride, we don't even bother. There is no pause. There's just, I'm right and you're wrong. And whatever you're doing over here, you're wasting my time, and now you're insulting me, and now we're going to fight about this because you're not that good either. Doesn't even pause to reflect and think that maybe there's something to that. Because see, the thing about it is when people offer scrutiny, criticism, or blatantly come after you, it's very, very rare that they just throw something at you that's completely untrue. And when they do, you recognize it because it's almost laughable. Somebody points at Dusty and says she's a loudmouth, and everyone looks at that person and is just like, what? Obviously that's not true. But when somebody looks at somebody and says they're a hypocrite because they're not following this part of their walk with Jesus, you claim to have a lot of faith, but you spend all this time fighting and striving in order to protect yourself at the cost of the people around you. And then you want to tell everybody that you're this big person of faith, that you believe in God to take care of you. You're you're not letting God take care of you. You're taking care of yourself, and you're just putting his name on it. That's not real faith. That's not real belief in God. That's not real anything. That's just you doing your own stuff and then stamping a title on it. There's this whole thing where we need to be able to stop and reflect and look at who we are and look at the reality of who we are. And sometimes that's hard. And I don't mean like just a little bit of introspection. I mean literally confronting your own shadow. Nobody likes to do this because everyone likes to think they're fine. Everybody prefers to be fine. And it's not just the prideful, it's everybody. I don't like to accept that maybe I don't know what I'm doing. I don't like to have to face the reality that I spend so much time caught up in the messes in front of me that I don't actually have long-term plans. When God puts that in front of me and says, you need to look at this and how you're actually acting, you're acting like a bully because you feel that what you have to do right now is so incredibly important that you'll run this guy in front of you off the road. And where does that come from? That comes from you feeling that you need to take care of this, and this matters more than what they're doing. There's a place to stop and look at what we're doing and why, even if it's unpleasant. And see, the funny thing about it is when we exist in a place where we're following God, there's always a constant move and push to grow in relationship with him. Not just in relationship, but for yourself to be refined as a person. See, you don't get to go to heaven being a cruel, sadistic, mean person. If you're willing to reject relationship with God, it invalidates you. And that's not to say you're going to lose your salvation. It simply says that, it shows where your heart is. And that's a dangerous thing to have in a place that isn't actually as safe as people like to imagine. Everyone imagines that when you go to heaven, everything's better and that you're a different person and that, it's almost like God has removed free will so that you don't have to worry about screwing up. Yet we have this whole story about Satan who chose to rebel against God and then took a third of the angels with him. A third of the angels in heaven looked at Satan, looked at God, and said, actually, we're going to go with this guy. That's the reality that we are moving forward to. There's a reason why there's a screening process. There's a reason why relationship is so incredibly important to God. If you don't love him, if you don't want him, if you don't want a relationship with him, and what's more is if you don't want to change, if you just want to stay the way you are and justify really, really crappy behavior every way, and especially if you want to try to put God's name on it, you're actually at that point even manipulating his character and making him look worse for people. That's bad. That's really, really bad. That's like me, going around to all of Stephanie's friends, saying really crappy things to them, treating them like garbage, and telling them, oh, well, it's okay because Steph told me to do this. Steph gave me the nod of approval to treat you this way. She said that you're a garbage person and I don't have to be nice to you. And then those people are going to go to Stephanie and be like, the hell? We do this stuff all the time with God, and we don't recognize it for what it is. It's why there's a whole message that we did on personage and giving God personage. Because sometimes for us, the only way that we're going to appreciate how we act and what we do is when we look at it from that perspective. Would I do this to another person? Would it be right for me to do this to another person? No. Is it therefore right for me to do this with God? Of course not. Even less so. So, talking about the confrontation in and of itself, the first thing is to recognize our own fallibility, and that none of us has it all together. There's this line from Socrates that I actually just read today, and I thought it was fitting. But it says something to the effect of, true wisdom is recognizing that I know nothing. And somebody could throw a temper tantrum about me quoting Socrates for a church group, but we can also read the first 3 chapters of 1 Corinthians where God says the same blasted thing, or where Paul says the same blasted thing over and over and over again, talking about the wisdom of God being foolishness to man, and about how God laughs at the wisdom of man because it's so linear, it's so lacking in perspective. Basically calling us into a place to recognize that God's wisdom and understanding supersedes our own, and that the best stance that we can have is one of humility and recognizing that we don't have it all together and we don't know everything. Sometimes God gives you a message or a clear picture of something. Sometimes he gives you a piece. I learned about the offices from a guy the spiritual offices from a guy who God revealed that to. In my time, God's revealed a lot of stuff to me about free will and time that apparently is revelation to a lot of people. Everybody has their little messages. I remember Jeremy being given a revelation about the names on ministries and who actually was in control of them, since it wasn't God's name on them. God can dispense these little revelations here and there and teach us things, but that doesn't make us the end-all be-all expert on these matters. I know a lot about spiritual warfare. It doesn't mean I know everything. I still don't understand why some demons require fasting and prayer and others don't. And I also don't understand how, in my experience, I've seen some where I've known the demon by name. At one point, they were too powerful to cast out, and then after overcoming them later on, it was child's play to cast them out. I don't understand all of that, and it would be deluded of me to try to claim that I do. The same is true with so much of the kingdom of God. When we're talking about something where the power that we exist in doesn't actually come from us, you don't get to master it, okay? If anybody comes up telling you that they're a master prophet and that they're going to share with you how to be a prophet, understand that that's token dispensationalism and that they only have so much to share. You need $1 and they're giving you 25 cents. And you're a fool if you actually believe that they're giving you the whole $1. And they're a fool, even more the fool for believing they have the whole $1. The point is that there's a place for us to recognize our own limitations. There's also a place for us to recognize that those limitations involve our understanding, our perception. It's not just about wisdom. It's about so much more. This group, from its inception, there have routinely been messages about looking beyond yourself. I don't know how many they've been, and frankly, it would be ridiculous to try to go over it. How many times I've had to say the words, you need to start seeing new perspectives on things. You need to look beyond what's here, what you understand, and talking about how difficult that is, because it is. If your experience tells you that the world works one way, and everything that you've had happen has confirmed that bias, it's going to be really hard to shake that, because that seems very, very real to you. But the problem is that's still a bias. And even then, because of it being a bias, when you have an experience that's actually counter to that, you can easily discard that in order to continue on with what you've already been believing. And these things are very important to consider when we're talking about confronting ourselves and these things where we're not actually okay, where we're not actually right. Where we have to confront our own shadow, that part of us that is dark. And especially when that dark part is something that you value and even worship. There are a lot of people who have gone through really, really hard situations. And hard's an understatement. They've been abused, they've been tortured, they've been hurt by people, they've been brainwashed, they've gone through all sorts of really, really, really terrible stuff. And in a lot of ways, they look at that dark side as being something that helped them get through. Because even though they had to do things in order to survive that hurt them internally, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, in every way, shape, or form. It's almost like it's like taking a couple of extra whips to avoid getting burned to death. It's the kind of thing where it's a brutal calculus that comes up in the mind, that especially in one that sees no hope in an alternative. And that's the thing, is we spent a message talking about hope a couple weeks ago because of how it can darken our perception so much if we don't have it, if we exist without it. And the longer that you exist in a difficult situation, in a abusive situation, the easier it is to start giving up on hope. Because the more and more unreal that becomes. And then when you're out of that situation and suddenly you're in a place where life's better, objectively better, and you've got people around you who love you and care about you and want to be there for you, you still carry those same mentalities. And as a result, you can't even appreciate what these people are giving to you. You'll still project your old abusers onto the people who love you now. And that's just a reality that we face, and there's no way past that if we're going to pretend it's not there. You're going to have to look at it, and you're going to have to confront it. And more than that, when you've moved out of that place, you're going to have to recognize that protective spirit is something that isn't necessary anymore. And you're going to have to part with it, because there's no place for that in the kingdom of God. I don't know why we like to imagine that we get to keep the swords and shields that we've crafted out of the bones of our enemies or our own, but for some reason we think we will. This is something that we have to look at and we have to face. These are things that we have to face. And sometimes we create this kind of persona. There's so many different facets to this that it's hard to put them all into a few quick words. But simply there are a lot of different characters that we can develop as a response to the world around us. And the trouble with it is that oftentimes since they are crafted in response to a broken world, they themselves are broken. So when we start coming to Jesus and saying, hey, we want to know you, we want to be close to you, he starts saying, that's got to change. You can't be that belligerent. You can't be that cruel. You can't be a sadist. If you enjoy hurting people, and one of the big values for God is mercy, it doesn't work. You can't keep both. If self-love is something that God values, but you're a masochist, something's got to change. And that change has to be something that's going to be permanent. So we talk about confronting these things, but what do we do when we're confronting them, right? I mean, aside from acknowledging that they're there, and that goes a long ways. Like, a lot of people don't recognize it. You know, if I want to pretend I'm not an anxious person, even though like I'm dripping with anxiety all the time, uh, you know, that doesn't really take me very far. I just continue to be an anxious mess who's pretending they're otherwise. But acknowledging it allows me to see it, allows me to recognize that it's there, and that goes a long way in the fact that, you know, when you're aware of it, cognizant of it, you're able to address it as it comes. But there's more than that. Like, a lot of our understanding ends there. It's at the part where we recognize that it's there. And a lot of us actually think that once we've recognized it, the battle's over. But there's this constant thing of having to address it as it comes again and again and again. You know, just because I recognize that I have an issue with pride, it doesn't mean I stop being a prideful person. It means that I'm still a prideful person, I just know about it now. The thing is that there's also a place to be willing to lay it down. And this is the hardest part. See, confronting it is hard enough. Acknowledging that you have a thing like this is hard enough. But laying it down is the hardest part of all, because it means you have to be willing to get rid of it. You have to be willing to change. And everyone's funny in the fact that they sit back and say, well, of course I'd be willing to change. I don't want to be depressed. I don't want to be anxious. I don't want to be cruel. I don't want to be evil. I don't want to be greedy. Until you actually have to give it up. And all those things that you get from that go away. See, we talk about faith in Jesus and transformation as followers, and I don't think a lot of people actually believe in it until they experience it. And even then, they don't really believe in it. It's really fascinating to me about how many times I've met people who have had these crazy transformations happen where Jesus does something in their life. Maybe he heals them of depression, or maybe he heals them of an anger problem. You find this person who is naturally just a belligerent, malicious person, and suddenly they're so serene and peaceful. You got sadists who suddenly are caring for people, loving people, and they have no interest in hurting them. Or masochists who have value for themselves. There are all these different facets, and you see this happen. And I've seen this happen many, many times in the church over the near decade now that I've been working with it. But the funny thing about it is when we move on to another subject, let's say our masochist also has an issue with greed. Well, God did this tremendous thing over here, but when it comes to talking about that and giving that up, they don't really believe so much. Also, they kind of like it. It makes them feel safe. So giving that up's really hard. And that's what I mean by this, is that we have to be willing to lay them down. If I have pride, I have to be willing to lay it down, all of it. Every facet of it, every part of it that I feel like protects me and keeps me safe in the face of people who are going to make me feel where I'm showing up and having to be vulnerable, but I'm using pride as a shield to kind of protect myself from the danger of other people and what they'll do to me as a result of me showing up and giving my heart to them. You know, pride has a fantastic way of being a good little suit of armor, but you have to be willing to let it go. If you don't, you know, it stays and you continue being where you are. You know, it's a comfort zone. It's fine. It feels safe, but, you know, nothing really grows there and you just stay the same person. And there's a great wealth of different things that are like that. Pride is just an easy example. But we have to be willing to let it go, all of it. And a lot of times you can't even begin to recognize why you want to keep this until you start trying to let it go. There's a lot of times where you've got people who will sit down for that prayer and their reaction is, well, yeah, I pray that I want to give that up, but in their hearts they're just like, I don't know if I really want to give that up. I kind of want to keep it. It's almost like handing the cup off and then holding on to it. It's mine now.
Yes. No, I want it.
But it's one of those things, like, we can't hold on to these things. We do have to let them go, and it is hard. It's very hard to do, because we have to be willing to kind of traverse the grimmer sides of our person, and maybe the things that we don't want to see. If it's one thing to already recognize that I have a problem with, we'll say deceit, lying. Lying's another good one, because a lot of people use lying as a means to protect themselves and the people around them. So if I want to address that, first I have to recognize that I have an issue with deceit. Okay, that's hard enough, because I don't like to see it, and I like to pretend that it's actually better for people. White lies are perfectly safe. Nobody ever gets hurt by them. So if I can bring myself to the point of recognizing that, okay, this is bad, this is what it is lying, then the next step is what? To confront it, recognize it for what it is, address it, say, okay, this needs to change, and then letting it go. And that's the part that's hard, because, well, I recognize that deceiving people is wrong, and I recognize that in the long run, it doesn't actually preserve me in any way, shape, or form, and it actually harms me as a person. I have to create these intricate webs of different things that I have to do in order to keep my lies real. And if I slip, that creates this tremendous calamity where, I lose friends, or relationships break down, or family turns their backs on me, or different things like that. But I also have to recognize that there are a lot of times where this has kept me safe from people, or gotten me what I wanted, where I wanted people to do what I wanted them to, and through lying to them I got them to do what I wanted them to. Well, that makes me a manipulative person too, and that's a whole other can of worms. That makes me controlling as well. So now I'm having to acknowledge that I'm controlling, I'm manipulative, and I'm deceitful. That's not fun. That's not fun to have that look of yourself for a minute. But the thing of it is that in our walks with God, we're never going to get anywhere until we start actually doing that. And the frustrating thing is that a lot of us have to some points, but there's still stuff. I wouldn't be preaching this blasted message if it wasn't for the fact that there's stuff to talk about. So it's hard. And it's fine that it's hard. And it's also fine that we struggle to give this stuff up. It's not malicious or bad per se. It's part of living in this world. Even in the midst of facing that, you're actually not as good of a guy or girl as you want to pretend you are, there's still a place to have grace for yourself and mercy for yourself as you traverse and find out why you actually do want to let this stuff go. Because the reality is that a lot of these safety mechanisms, kind of going back to the discussion about Magneto earlier and his story, he did what he did in order to preserve his people. And in doing so, he probably did more damage than good in terms of trying to save his people. And that's what happens with us in these particular situations. Like, to be clear, there have been so many fights that I've had with my wife over me trying to protect myself from things that weren't real. And there are so many fights that my wife and I have had with her trying to protect herself from things that aren't real. And there are so many fights that I've had with so many people over a decade of working in the church with them trying to protect things that aren't real. They were trying to protect their pride, their egos, this fragile identity that they're trying to make work and try to claim is from Jesus. They're trying to protect their own hearts, in essence, from the damages that can be accrued by being around other people. It's been an endless thing, and nobody's free of it. At least not often. And that's not to say that it's impossible to become free of it. It's simply to say that most of the times we're not. There is this process of refinement. And that is something that we all have to go through. It's very important. We go through fire. And we come out of it stronger, assuming that we're willing to embrace it as opposed to pretend like it doesn't burn us. But this is the process that we need to lay down for ourselves. Confront who you are, the real who you are, and be honest about it. And even when it is like a thing, like we were talking about earlier, where somebody says something and it's offhand, give it a moment. Mill on it, think about it. If it's untrue, it's untrue, obviously. If there is truth to it, though. And also, don't do it alone all the time. Sometimes what we need is to have somebody else to kind of protect us from our own tendency to self-criticize. Because that's another kind of pitfall that can happen. If I spend a lot of time in introspection, I've got somebody that tells me that something and it actually plays on one of my personal insecurities, it creates a sort of false positive, and suddenly I'm begging God to forgive me for something that isn't even bad, isn't even wrong with me. But I believe it's true, and that person said it, so it must be true, it's confirmed it, even though that I recognize that person was actually just trying to hurt me. It's important to have a friend or somebody there who can actually serve to see the real you and even call out who you really are in the face of your own insecurities and doubts. Which correlates to a lot of what we'll be doing tonight and why we have the mirrors. But we'll talk about that more in a minute. In the meantime, that's what I've got, and then Dusty's got stuff she's going to share.
And it kind of goes with things, people feeling like a lot of adversity right now and feeling just not okay in themselves either. Like you don't really feel at home inside of yourself, but those are like the pieces of you that are being burned away. I kept getting like a lot of images that were of myself in various things of like being on fire and going through that. And I constantly see like this metal or like silver frame underneath. But there was this thing that was kind of interesting, especially after Nathan told me what we were gonna do tonight, about how when people are refining metal, the refiner doesn't stop until he is able to see his reflection in the metal, as you would like a mirror. And there was a thing about how you do not grow through comfort, but rather discomfort. And that's about it. Because I don't know, and there was a thing, like, when I was praying about it later, trying to, like, figure out, because I feel like I only have, like, part of it or something, like, it doesn't feel full, or, like, I have everything. But this morning I was praying about what this was supposed to be about, and I got Proverbs 8, the entire chapter, and it's about Lady Wisdom and all the things that wisdom is. So the only conclusion that I've drawn from that is that that's what's supposed to be. It's supposed to be at least one of the things left over from after, like, all the dross and things are burned away. It's just like like burning up the garbage. It's really hard because you have to let go of a lot, you know, and it's hard to let go of things because they've been, like, so ingrained in you for so long, even if it hasn't been for a long time, and it's just been a couple years or something. It's gonna take a while to get rid of it. You have to relearn how to do everything. You have to unlearn all the things that you learned and that you went through, and turn it into something that you can pass on to somebody else to ease their suffering in a way. I think that's one more. Attitude. You have to have the right attitude and the right posture to, like, have those things happen too, because if you start coming at things from a totally negative aspect, like, everything's gonna go to complete shit. You have to, like, really try to, like, be positive, even though it's super hard. It's way easier said than done, but, like, your attitude and gratitude play, like, a super big piece in that, and somehow they're, like, related to, like, praise and trust and, like, hope and things like that too. It's still very blurry, but it is, like, when you start having, like, gratitude for things and, like, paying attention to, like, especially, like, others over yourself, like, pulling out from self-absorption, like, it does things to you. Like, you just naturally start, like, changing things. You don't, if you're focusing on it too much, it's not gonna work. It's gonna make the problem bigger. It's just gonna get worse.
I know that I've had that happen personally, where, like, God had to get after me because I spent way too much time, like, looking at myself in the mirror and, like, trying to find things. And it got to a point where he's just like, why don't you go do something for somebody else? Like, go pray for that person. Go hang out with that person, minister to them. Go talk to that person. Be a friend. You know, stuff like that.
Well, like, that's, like, something, like, when you are, like, trying to figure yourself out and, like, find all your faults and flaws and things, and try to, like, grow for the better, it ends up kind of turning against you, because for one, you're paying attention to yourself about who you are, which became kind of apparent apparent, like, after I sat with you guys the last time in the car, and Jeremy was like, "Oh, hey Dusty, you're wrong about things." I was like, ugh. Thanks for that punch in the face. Like, but then, like, I really started thinking about it too, and that does make a lot of sense, because you, no matter what you're focusing on, like the negative or positive aspects of yourself, it's probably going to be greatly exaggerated or under exaggerated. It depends on what you're looking for. You're always going to find what you're looking for, and that's not really useful. But when you have like people pointing things out to you, it's a lot easier to like kind of gauge things, and that is community. Things.